Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fireside chat. As women, we've always done this. We've gotten together and had our conversations around campfires in the beginning, in our homes, in our kitchens, over backyards, however and wherever we could gather to share our stories. And today I get to share my story and her story with one of my favorite women on the planet. Please welcome Jacqueline Novogratz.
Thank you so much, Pat. And it is just such an incredible honor to be here with you. And it's exciting to be with BOMA Global and BOMA India.
And I think maybe we should introduce ourselves a little bit more than that. So let me just tell you a bit about who you'll be hearing the questions from. I'm Pat Mitchell, and I had a long and interesting career in media, going from being a reporter originally to a producer and eventually an executive. And using that platform all the way through to elevate the stories and ideas of women. And I'm now focused almost entirely on ways to not only elevate women's stories and ideas, but to increase the representation of women from all places in the world, from all geographies, all sectors of life and work, into leadership positions, because our voices are needed more than ever. So I am grateful that BOMA India and BOMA Global exist for that purpose of fostering and strengthening women's community and women's leadership. My dear, dear friend, Jacqueline Novogratz, has been empowering women and men all over the world throughout her life. What an interesting path she has taken, and I can't wait for her to share that with you. But all of it has led her to write two remarkable books, which I just want to mention off the top. So get ready to take note, because these are must reads. The first is called Blue Sweater, and it's a memoir of Jacqueline's early years and tells a story that you'll hear parts of today, but the book tells it in such a compelling way that it truly is a must read for every woman and girl and man in the world, in my opinion, and gratefully has been read by millions. The new book is a manifesto so needed for our time. In fact, that's what it's called. Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. We're going to talk about this, exactly what the manifesto is and what is a moral revolution and what's our part, women and girls all over the world, in such a revolution. But before we get to the revolution, Jacqueline,
Well, and
let's
even
go
before
back
we
to the
get to that,
beginning.
if we could, even before we start, Pat, I think both you and I always start with gratitude. And you so undersold yourself, like women so often do. And I just want to start with gratitude to you, to women of your generation, but especially for me personally, to you. I think when we do talk about young women, women on a path, that it's so important for all of us always to remember the shoulders on which we stand. And I've been reading the biographies of Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister, the first woman doctor, and her little sister, who was one of the next women doctors, and just what they went through in the early 1800s. And then I think about a few generations, probably 10 generations later, what you all did, and you particularly, Pat, and I hope we get to talk about some of that path breaking too. And you also didn't talk about your book called Becoming a Dangerous Woman. And I also think that's a theme of what I hope we get to talk about today, because when you do go into the world and you create change, even in the way you carry yourself in the world, which is what you have always done, you can sometimes make people uncomfortable. And you certainly will be uncomfortable yourself. And it is something you have done with so much grace and ferocity. And And not only are you one of my favorite human beings in the world, but you really are a teacher. So it's a real honor.
Well, thank you for that, Jacqueline. And I do think it's interesting and helpful in this conversation, which I love having at any occasion, and I'm grateful for this one, to recognize that we do come from two different generations of women, and there are probably many more generations listening and joining us today. And it's important only because each generation has its own challenges and its own barriers to overcome. My generation was the one, as you suggest, that was in the streets marching for women's rights, but we weren't the first. There had been other waves of feminists taking to the streets all over the world, many way before women in the United States did that. But in the 60s, I came of age at two great social justice movements, civil rights and the women's movement. And both of those formed my life's journey to eventually becoming a dangerous woman, as I write about in the book, because I learned a lot about what that means to be out of your comfort zone, to be taking risk, to putting yourself into situations where you do feel uncomfortable, but it is necessary to do so. So I'm happy to have been. I'm privileged, not happy, privileged to have been in those struggles and remain in those struggles. And we won some battles. But when you came along a generation later, there were still many challenges to what you could be and dream of being as a girl growing up, and where you saw yourself in the universe of dreams and ambitions. So let's go back to that time for you. You grew up in a military family, many brothers and sisters. What were the expectations for you as a child, and how did you move beyond them?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. You know, I actually think I was incredibly lucky in my nuclear family, in that my mother was raised by a single woman in New York City. And so, and my grandmother on the other side was an immigrant who came to the United States with no more than a third grade education. And my grandfather was a cement hauler. So they were the true American immigrant story. But in different ways, both women lived inside of me. And so Loretta, my mother's mother, I think she saw no bounds, even though clearly she couldn't get a checking account, even though she was raising two girls in New York City. She couldn't buy anything on credit without usually an uncle's signature. And I was aware of that as a girl. And the grandmother on the other side, who was so shy and lacked so much confidence, I don't think she really allowed herself dreams. And so I grew up in this rough and tumble family with very few role models around me. But I was an avid reader. And I would read in the library about people like Elizabeth Blackwell, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harriet Tubman, and I wanted to be like them. And it wasn't really until I was probably in my 20s where I started to see live women who I knew. Because of course in my teens, you and Gloria Steinem and others came along, but I didn't have those kinds of role models. And then I went into banking, and there were very few women anywhere in the banking industry. So in some ways, I'm not sure I had expectations. I just knew from the time I was a little girl that I was going to change the world. And so I think maybe, Pat, there was a freedom, because I never thought about a career path. I just thought about being used to change the world.
And that has motivated you your whole life. It is interesting listening to this, how much grandmothers figure into all women's stories, right? My grandmother was an uneducated, partially indigenous woman who married to avoid punishments of all kinds, which were happening for indigenous peoples in this country in those days. But she told stories. She was totally uneducated, but she told me stories all the time about things that I could imagine, places she'd never been. And grandmothers imprint that very early. Now, as a grandmother, by the way, I think about that all the time as I try and encourage my granddaughters to think big and to think beyond boundaries. So you did go into a rather, well, not traditional. I mean, going into banking itself, even in your generation, was still a man's world. And you could have, though, been very successful there, and you were successful there. So what changed? What was the spark that caused you to say, no, this isn't my path, and to choose another way?
Really two things, Pat. One was having gone to Catholic schools as a little girl, always wanting to, give more to the world than you take. Seeing the vibrancy of places like Chile and Colombia, Brazil, and it was really Brazil, where I saw the vibrancy as I would walk through the streets on the weekends, up in the slums, the favelas, low-income people who were working so hard. And I would juxtapose that with the quiet of the bank, where people like that were not even welcome to walk through the doors. And that was, I thought there has to be a better way. And that indeed, if we lent to low and middle income people in the countries in which the bank was operating, not only might we really contribute to the country, but we might have a better chance of getting our money back, because we were in a financial crisis. And the second thing, when I'm really honest, and I do think it's connected to this generation, but in some ways maybe more to yours and mine, is I was always somewhat of a renegade. And so I would dress in these big skirts and refuse to wear the man's uniform, which is what we were required to wear. And yet I was the most productive person in my group at the bank. And so my bosses didn't know what to do with me, and literally had conversations saying, we're going to hold your salary raise because you're our most productive. We see this huge opportunity for you here, but you shouldn't laugh so much, and you have to tone down the way that you dress. And I thought, look, I work 80 hours a week here. If I change those fundamental parts of myself, who will I be? And I actually, Pat, think it was the duality. It was this knowledge that we are changed by the cultures in which we operate and live, and by this deep desire that I had to understand what it would take to bring banking, which I believed in the financial services, to people who had never been included.
That battle, that internal battle that began so early for women and girls between who we see ourselves to be, who we know ourselves to be, strong, brave, courageous, that we feel at 10 and 11 and 12, and then that we lose as we start to take in the world's view of us. And then we find ourselves in work situations where, as you say, you're asked to change fundamental things about who you are, someone who laughs easily, someone who enjoys fashion and dressing, to fit in. And that's still there. Those are still pressures that I'm sure the women and girls listening to us today are shaking their heads going, I've been there, I've experienced that. So the family pressures, the business pressures, and then this need, as you had, which so many of us have, to fix things, to make things better, not just for ourselves, but obviously for other women. And for you, that set you on a path that was clearly outside your comfort zone. And going to Rwanda, tell us about that story, which you recount in Blue Sweater, and please do read the full story. But for now, what led you there? What changed for you there?
So when I first went to Africa, the continent, I actually landed in West Africa to work with a nonprofit where I was supposed to help extend financial services across the continent, and be an ambassador to women. And I just failed mightily for a whole host of reasons, including my own probably lack of humility that you might not have noticed when you saw me, but that the sense that I had that I was there to change the world and to save, the African people in a way. And I think the great gift of falling powerfully on my face was that I discovered by age 25 that most people don't want to be saved. And they certainly didn't want to be saved by a young white American who barely spoke French and whose understanding of the nation that I was in, let alone the many different tribes, languages, cultures, the context, was an inch deep. And so I moved to East Africa, to Kenya. And I had met a woman at a conference in Abidjan, in West Africa. And she walked into my office one day and she said, we've just gotten, for the first time in history, this is 1986, putting you back in history, Rwanda just changed its laws. And for the first time in history, women can open a bank account without their husband's signature. And so we want to look at creating some kind of financial mechanism. And we would like you to come to our country. Well, she had a very thick accent, and I didn't have a very strong understanding of the 54 countries. And I kept thinking she was saying Uganda. And I was like, I love Uganda. She was like, no, Rwanda. And finally I was like, Rwanda? I've never been to Rwanda. And it was this tiny country, 6 million people at the time. I think at that moment, Pat, I knew, even though I was only going for 3 weeks, that I was not leaving until I had built a bank. In part because it was the first time, after a lot of failures by this point, 6 months in Africa, that it was the first time that any local woman had invited me to support what they wanted to do. And that made all the difference. And then I realized that if we were going to build a bank, I would not be able to do it by myself. We would have to co-found it, and that I would get rid of language, the language of I. From then on, it was we. And I feel really lucky that I got to learn those things so early on, that this would be a local institution run by local women. I even had the crazy audacity then, when the average income was $112 a year, to insist that women in the bank contributed something so that they owned it too. And I think that spirit is hopefully still very much alive in everything that I and Acumen does now.
And it sets some principles in place very early on. Shared responsibility, putting the good of the community ahead of profits, principles that you were applying even early on, in which we do find from research and data that women in leadership positions, running companies or any enterprise, do tend to bring those virtues or those qualities and values forward, especially if we remain true to our sort of intrinsic, what I believe are intrinsic feminine values.
I think that's right, Pat. I also think we understand, especially if we listen to the truthful part of ourselves and not the world that tells us to look smart, look powerful, look all those other kinds of things. I think we understand that knowledge, information, words are not really that useful unless people understand them. And I think that's another conceit in the financial sector that is overlooked, as well as in development and in the nonprofit sector, because we have real skills to offer, but the elites too often throw around symbols and fancy words in ways that exclude rather than include. And I was just thinking about this yesterday, actually, and I need to find it. As Acumen goes, into its 20th year, that one of the early things that I did, because it was so clear to me that even women at the highest levels had never really learned finance, which is understandable if no one could have a bank account. And so I took the teachings of my Chase credit training program, a year-long program at one of the best banks in the world, and I translated the whole thing so that I could teach it to not only the women who helped build the bank, but the market women. And I would sit there in the market with like, this is a credit, this is a liability, this is how it works. I was teaching people cash flow, and I think I just had such a sense that everyone has capability, but it's only when you learn that you are even capable yourself that you can move into it. And I actually think we need more of that kind of tool that makes this kind of, you know, economic and financial and market language even more accessible, because people can go through their whole lives afraid of money, afraid of finance, afraid of numbers, and yet all that is numbers. Once you learn to control it, it is a superpower.
Well, I want to talk much more about the superpower because, as you know, from having read my book, money was something that my family never talked about. We didn't have any, but we also never talked about it. And therefore, I grew up afraid of really understanding this primary force in our lives and in the world, which is understanding your own personal finances and how they work in the world. And it took that. I'm not a very good role model when it comes to that. I was almost an example of what a friend said, you know, finance is the final frontier for feminism. we have to overcome this barrier, because having capital, having access to capital, understanding capital and its resources, wherever we may be on the scale of financial viability, is critical to the kind of progress that we wish for all women. And that really, believing that as you did, seeing that in practice, is what you put into practice when you created Acumen almost 20 years ago. So explain, if you will, for those who may not know, what is the basic principle of Acumen, and how it literally is changing lives and the world in many, many countries.
Thanks, Pat. So what you said is so powerful, that it's really understanding capital and then learning how to control capital rather than being controlled by capital, which I think is the problem with today's unbridled capitalism, is that the world is controlled by the pursuit of money rather than using money for the pursuit of good. And so I had apprenticed, if you will, for 15 years, building a bank, building a bakery. So I understood small business, working in philanthropy with small enterprise across the United States as well as the developing world. And I decided that what we've overlooked when we think about philanthropy is all that is money. And it actually should be the money where we have the most risk-taking ability. But if you think about where people put their philanthropy, it's often where it's safest. I'll feed a child for the day. I will give money to a school. And all of that is needed, but that's not going to create systemic change. And what we need right now is systemic change. And so when you think that there's, you know, 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity when we started, or water when we started, and healthcare goes without saying, look at the pandemic, that what if, we asked, what if you took philanthropy and rather than just give it away, and I'm a believer in grant making, so let's be clear, but to invest it in entrepreneurs that were trying to solve those big problems, water, healthcare, agriculture, housing. And how long would you have to accompany that entrepreneur so that she could ultimately solve a really big problem and influence not hundreds of lives, but millions of lives? the model for patient capital, which is what we called it, was that when money came back, we would reinvest it into other innovation for low-income people. And today, as you know, our probably 130 companies have brought critical services to over 300 million people. And just a quick example would be in electricity, where the reason you need this kind of capital and the reason markets can play a role is that getting clean energy to 1.5 billion people costs a lot of money. Imagine a $30 unit, even just for a light, forget about an electricity system, too much philanthropy. And so could you build a company whereby the market would actually ask you to listen to poor people who are too often seen as passive recipients waiting for somebody to give them charity, when in fact they, like all of us, want to solve our own problems, make our own decisions? Could you use the market as a way of listening? But again, with that word humility, recognizing that the market can only go so far. And so our big success is a company called Duality, which started with a $30 solar light, listened to what consumers wanted, found a way to price it so that they could afford it in a way that they could value it, understood how people made decisions without deciding what was good for them. And that company has brought light and electricity to over 100 million people. And there are two quick stories, if I might, Pat, to just hit that home, why this became so important to me. One was sitting in a little hut in Kenya, talking to a grandmother named Teresia, who was taking care of her 1-year-old grandchild. And it was the first time in her life that she had solar rather than dirty kerosene, which was the way people lit their homes. And she was so proud of this light. And I was with this big Australian man named David Small, ironically. And I said, Teresia, tell Mr. Small what you like about the light and how you would improve it. And she put her hand on her hip, kind of jauntily, and she said, I like that it's not smelly. I like that it's not dangerous for my child, etc. She said, but if I could charge my cell phone at the same time that I charge my light, well, then I could I could charge other people's cell phones and charge them for it. And I could earn income from my light. And that would help me buy more lights. And a literate grandmother. And she said, number 2, and she went on with 4 different possible changes he could make. And I was watching him listen to her, not with the arrogance of too many philanthropists, not with the certainty of too many investors, but trying to earn her trust. And I saw her not pandering as someone who wanted to tell him a story so he would give her more things, but as a customer who deserved his trust. And it was in that interchange that I saw what is most important to everything Acumen does, and that is human dignity. This idea that at the end of the day, dignity is more important to us than income or wealth, although income is needed for choice. It's being seen, it's having agency, it's having capability and decision making. And that is why I think that this is very powerful.
The stories of Acumen are such a powerful testimony to a different way of using capital, to identifying the people with ideas who are motivated by service and investing in them. And a great example of patience, recognizing that things don't just happen overnight. And I want to talk more about some of the lessons that we can all take from the entrepreneurs that you have met and Acumen has supported. But I want to go back for just a moment because I'm thinking how many women may be listening to us now and thinking, well, I have this big idea that I believe would change my community, my country, my business, whatever. and are hitting the resistance that comes with almost everything that's new, almost everything that challenges the status quo. So talk about those early days. What did you hear when you talk to financial people about, hey, I've got this idea, I'm going to invest in people who serve the poor? How did you face those challenges? What were they? How did you respond to them?
Yeah. Well, given that people on the call may be at all ages, I often talk about the importance of practicing courage, because as you move along, you need more and more courage. And sometimes the first big courageous act is telling your parents that you want to do something very unconventional. And so I would say the first resistance I encountered leaving, particularly as a kid who did grow up in a family like yours, Pat, that we had no money. And so finally I was on this track, and I had been offered this huge promotion, telling my parents that instead I was taking this left turn, took a lot of courage
Courage.
to make that decision. But I think it then helped me take the next step. And I remember in starting Duality, so now, being at this point 25, 26 in Rwanda, and men stopping me in the street and saying, "You're ruining our women." And I'd say, "I'm not doing anything. I am just a co-founder with, I would name the women, and we're just providing opportunities." And the status quo also showed up in ways that I didn't expect. The local priest came to our office and said, "This is usury." And I said, "Sir, how could this be usury? We're charging 12% a year rather than 600%, which is what women are paying the money lenders." And so I started to learn at an early age that the status quo exists for a reason. It works for people, and it is often about control. And so by the time I started Acumen, I realized that we were disrupting a system, that there was a growing ideology that markets were the answer to everything, that traditional capitalism that supported the shareholders would ultimately trickle down. And now 20 years ago, that was seen as truth. That was seen almost as religion. And so there were many humiliating moments where by this point, I was 40 years old. I had built different institutions. I had raised a lot of money, and I would go into offices on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley with people I deeply admired and still admire. And I would tell them what the model was, and they would say, "Well, Jacqueline, obviously you don't understand how business operates. I make my money here and I give it away there." And I would say, "But it's not solving problems of poverty. And I'm focused on people who make $2 and $3 a day. And isn't capital just capital?" And he was like, "You're so muddled." And when you hear that enough, you start to think, maybe I'm not right. And I would say the second big thing you hear is, "It's wonderful what you're doing, but it's not scaled. It's too small." And I'd say, "But no one else is trying. Shouldn't we at least try?" The truth is, if 1.5 billion people after 140 years since Thomas Edison invented the light bulb still do not have electricity, I don't know, call me crazy. Maybe we should take a bet on these two young people who have a solution. And sure enough, now we're the largest off-grid solar energy investor in the world who focus on the poor. And all those companies, not just ours, but in that whole ecosystem that did not exist in 2007, now account for 400,000 jobs. And about 40% of them are women. And those jobs are not dead-end jobs. Those jobs are the opportunity then for a whole cohort, a whole new generation to be part of solving the problems in their own countries. And that generation, Pat, will be the next generation of entrepreneurs. But had I listened to them, and it's hard not to listen to them because it's lonely and you cry a lot, or at least I did. you just have to keep your head down and keep doing the work, because the people who end up changing the world are not the smartest people. They're the people who are the grittiest, who are the most persistent, and who hold to that hard edge top optimism, even though you get hit down over and over.
They are the dangerous women.
They are the dangerous women.
Well, women, well, what I mean by dangerous, as you know, is not to invoke fear, but to be fearless and to be willing to be brave and bold and speak up when staying silent would be safer, and to speak out and to stand up and take risk. Because as you said so well, the status quo has every reason to hold on to the status quo. It's called power, holding on to the power and control, and it's not ever given up easily. So when women step forward and do what you did, Jacqueline, take an idea and move it forward through the barriers, through the naysayers, through the people holding on to another way, and prove that it can be done another way, well, that's dangerous. And it changes the world. And Acumen has changed so many lives and impacted so many communities. I sat in that boardroom and heard those inspiring stories and felt such a privilege to be engaged. And India is one of the places we're speaking today with BOMA India. And it was one of the places where I know you found some of the most inspiring young people, young women in particular, with those big ideas, who were willing to be dangerous enough to face the problems and challenges.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, and it's often these young people for sure, and young women who are really coming up with new ways to use markets, and reimagine capitalism. I think of Suhani Mohan. It's a really, her company is radically structured. So she, like me, started off in banking. She was the #1 in her batch at the IIT Mumbai. And so for anyone who's not Indian, this is one of the best schools on the planet, one of the hardest schools to get in, and she was #1. Then she went to banking, and while she was a banker, still very young, she realized that when it came to menstrual health, her country women were way, way, way behind. And it made no sense to her that women were dying, women were falling sick, for something that is just part of what it means to be human and female. And so she built a company as an engineer to make very, very low cost sanitary napkins. But she understood that to get to far-flung villages, she would need to deal with climate change and to deal with talent, that she couldn't have one manufacturing plant in Mumbai then bring out big trucks up into far-flung villages, because during the monsoons, those roads were not even accessible. And so she created what is called the distributed manufacturing model. Rather than one big factory, she started with tiny factories, and now she's grown to 40 factories. The second radical thing she did, which made it almost impossible for her to raise traditional capital, was understanding that she was operating in areas where trust is almost non-existent, sometimes very dangerous areas, that she couldn't just use some international brand, nor possibly even one brand. And so she made the truly radical decision, because she was driven by the problem that she was solving, to allow each factory to create its own brand. And for investors in a consumer good, like in healthcare, everything is about the brand, and think about those brands that you trust. And so she was saying, that's true. But if you're in a tiny isolated village that never leaves the village, everything's about the trust that comes from the people that you know. And so she went forward. And I think she's up to now, 6 or 8 million that she sold. And then using flexibility, nimbleness, social capital, not just thinking about financial capital. When COVID hit, believe it or not, at the beginning, sanitary napkins were not considered an essential good, and so her operations had to shut at the beginning. She used her network to talk to government and allow the opening of it, but she still had low-income women who, if they lost their jobs, would not be able to feed their families, and they were her employees. And so one of her buddies worked at Mahindra, a big trucking company, and he found a way to get a factory and allow Suhani to get the factory to re-engineer so that they could now produce the sanitary napkins. And she brought a whole group of women who lived there. They lived in this big warehouse because they weren't allowed in the streets in those first 100 days. And I don't know how many she's produced since then, but I've just watched her fundamentally flip upside down what we take for granted, solve a problem in a way that truly empowers some of the poorest and most isolated women.
One of the great ironies of this incredible time we're all living in with this global pandemic is that it has, on the one hand, so adversely impacted women negatively. I mean, certainly in terms of the economic recession being felt in every country, there's no question that more women are victims of that. More women are losing jobs every month than men in almost every country, plus all the other things that women have to do, educating their children at home and all the familial responsibilities too. And yet at the same time, during this time of challenge and change, you see women like this flipping things, pivoting so quickly, immediately seeing the creative answer or finding the innovative solution. And you see with women who lead countries, from presidents of countries who proved to be the most effective leaders in the pandemic, to entrepreneurs who are managing to find solutions on the ground to problems, as this young woman did. It says a lot about the resilience of women as leaders. Yes? Do you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it says a lot about the opportunity of crisis and of this moment of interconnectedness, but absolutely with women, because I think it is about that deep listening, not just with our ears, but with our eyes, with all parts of ourselves, and having a clear North Star and, frankly, a different definition of success. I think that when you didn't grow up fully in that system of money, power, and fame being the only definition, it's a little easier to move to our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth, which we must put at our center, and that is the moral revolution. But I also think of Sarah Khurram, a Pakistani woman who started a company because in her country, 30% of women doctors stop working after they marry. You talk about a loss of human potential and capability. And so, and yet, before the pandemic, her assumption would have been, which was proven out, was that rural women wouldn't pay to use a technology app for a consultation with traditional telemedicine. So she built a series of 26 private health clinics where doctors, well-educated doctors, could have consultations with the clinical worker who would then work with the rural woman. Similar situation, lockdown happens. Private clinics are also locked down. And so Sarah just immediately, day one, pivots, says, well, I have this app. I'll make it free. And I will make a call to women doctors to volunteer their time. And Pat, within days, everything changed. And the rural women now they had no other option. They start now using this app talking to very qualified doctors, not only did Pakistani women within the nation, but around the world, including New Zealand, volunteered. That then allowed her such heft that she could go to government, who allowed then the non-Pakistani certified doctors to participate. And my belief, and it's now more than belief, is that this approach is going to be integrated into the way that healthcare is delivered. And so it's not being afraid that you're too small. It is staying focused on what your purpose is. It is having the courage and the nimbleness to pivot and not ask for permission.
Yeah. You've named already some of the principles of the manifesto for a moral revolution. Talk a bit more about those, because they apply no matter what business you might be in, whether you're an entrepreneur, or you're working for a big company, or you're in a social enterprise. Whatever you're doing, there is a reason, and there are great outcomes possible if you think through every part of what you're doing is applying the manifesto for a moral revolution. What are its principles?
Well, there are 12, actually I call them practices, because I think that these you have to practice in life, because it's too easy to say, listen, well, I listen. The more you're conscious about listening, the more we realize that it's a very under-practiced and deeply needed skill. Probably the most important is what we call the moral imagination. It is being able to see the world you want to change, and that takes audacity, but having the humility to recognize the world that is. And we're at a moment right now where I think we're all afraid. And so we often think we know the answers, and we scream it at each other with righteousness. You're wrong. This is the answer. The truth is, if we had the answers, our world wouldn't look the way it is looking. So seeing what you want to see to change, but understanding where you are. Listening, we already talked about. I'd say the third most important is daring to hold opposing values, truths, intention. There's a difference between the activists who can be more pure, if you will, uncompromising. They see the world that they want. Activists, they don't have to deal with the mess that is, thankfully, because we need those truth tellers who are in the streets. The builders, unfortunately, or fortunately, have to live in that world of compromise. You have to be generous and accountable. You have to recognize that sometimes you have to partner with people you do not like or even agree with. And otherwise, the system doesn't change. And so holding opposing truths and values, intention, avoiding the conformity trap, in some ways we've already talked about, because the world has 1,000 ways to take away your courage. Doing what's right, not what's easy, is hard at the beginning. It gets harder as you get more successful. And I think it's all connected to what we've been talking about and being dangerous. And then the one that I would end with is embrace the beautiful struggle. The work of change is long and hard. And when you're young, I thought, oh, 3 years, I'll create this beautiful institution. And 7 years later, there was a genocide in that nation. And then it was years and years and years of watching women rebuild. But change is possible. Change is possible. But you have to be in this for 30 years, a lifetime of years. And sometimes it's more than a lifetime. So what sustains you? And for me, it's the embrace of beauty. It's to recognize that at every step of the way, there's beauty to be found. And some of us find it in faith or religion. Some of us find it in meditation. Some of us find us in running or poetry. Some of us find it, you and I, Pat, both in connecting with another human being in a really deep way and remembering why we do the work that we do. And we also share that we sometimes find it in dancing and long conversations. But if you don't know what sustains you, you better find it because you need it.
That is the absolute best guidance we could give to any community of women. Dance, sing, find the friends that are become your renewable sense of energy. I call my friends my renewable source of energy. And it is a privilege to call you a friend, Jacqueline, and to just repeat a couple of things among the many, many things that were said today by Jacqueline that are guideposts to living a full and fulfilled life, doing what's right and not what's easy, embracing the beautiful struggle. And if I might just add, as I am feeling now deeply, having had this time with you, Jacqueline, and with all of you, find your beloved community. Find your place there and move forward there together. What is that wonderful African proverb? You know, if you want to travel fast, travel alone. But if you want to go far, no, I've got it backwards.
No, you have it right. If you want to go fast, go alone.
Want
If
to
you
go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we all want to go far. And we want to go far in ways that create a better world. And Jacqueline, you have done that every step of your journey. Thank you for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for accompanying me. And I look forward to accompanying each other for the rest of our journeys. And as actually Ram Dass says, you know, our job is to walk each other home. And I think that's what this is all about. And how do we walk each other home well beyond just the small group of people that we grew up with the world that needs all of us.
Namaste, Jacqueline.
Namaste, Pat Mitchell.